I'm going to start out with a trick question. Now, I'm not really trying to trick you, but I want to make you think a little bit. Okay, I am trying to trick you. What was the first thing that God created? This is creation weekend, right? So we should know what the first thing God created was, right? What was the first thing God created? Anybody? Heavens and the earth. That's very good. I was reading, and I was very surprised, actually, that God created something else first. And I want us to look at it. It's found in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 8. I read this and I was like, wow, God created this before He created the earth. Proverbs chapter 8, starting in verse 23. Now I'm not going to tell you who I was, but some of you already know. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth, while as yet He had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When He prepared the heavens, I was there. When He set a compass upon the face of the depth, when He established the clouds above, when He strengthened the fountains of the deep, when He gave to the sea His decree that the waters should not pass His commandment, when He appointed the foundations of the earth, I was by Him, rejoicing always before Him. Who am I? Wisdom. God created wisdom. When I read this, I thought to myself, this has to have maybe a double meaning, because a lot of it applies to Jesus. So we start off with a question, another question. We're talking about creation. We're talking about Genesis 1 verses 1 and 2, which of course says, in the beginning. And I want to start out by asking the question, when was in the beginning? There's lots of opinions about this, but I want to try to answer them as much as I can from the Bible. When was in the beginning? Let's look at Mark chapter 10, verse 6. Mark chapter 10, verse 6. There's more verses that talk about this, but I'm just going to bring out this one for right now. Mark 10, verse 6. Jesus is talking here, and He's answering the Pharisees. And He says, but from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So Jesus here is linking the phrase, in the beginning, to the creation of man, the creation of Adam and Eve. Next question. What was created in the beginning? Let's go to Isaiah 40, verse 21. Isaiah 40, verse 21. What was created in the beginning? And Isaiah 40, verse 21, have ye not known? Have ye not heard? Hath it not been told you from the beginning? Have ye not understood from the foundations of the earth? I would like to submit to you today that in combination with this, in combination with also what we read in Job 38, verse 4, which says that, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. That what God created in the beginning were the foundations of the earth. And as we've already read, as it's already been read this morning, how rapidly did God create what we see in the beginning? If you look at Psalm 33, 6 and 9, to me it gives a very clear description of the actions of creation, the speed at which God created. Psalm 33, 6 and 9. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he gathereth the waters of the sea together as a heap. He layeth up the depth in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. I would like to submit to you that God created the foundations of the earth in the beginning, and he created them instantaneously, because when he spoke, they came into existence. So I want to talk to you about some things that gets into a little bit of dangerous territory today, because we're trying to bring together two elements. And the two elements that we're trying to bring together are spiritual elements, which of course cannot be explained by science, and scientific elements, which of course by nature don't invite religion. And when you try to bring those two together and you make sense out of them, there's always conflict. Even within our own church, believe it or not, there can be conflict. And especially outside of our church, there's conflict about the, you know what? I'm glad that I brought my little power cord that's already plugged in. We're going to see if this is going to fire up, because I think my battery decided not to hold up as long as I wanted it to. But in any event, when we try to bring these two elements together, science and creation, you know, college classes are made of this. When you go to college, it's like you can maybe take a class in science and creation and trying to understand the connection between the two. But I believe there is a connection, because if the earth was created by God, then that means all of the science that we see related to that in some way can be explained in spiritual terms, because God is the one that did it. So I think our job is to search for ways to reconcile what we see there. And I believe that we can do that. And my job this morning, or my goal is this morning, is to introduce to you evidences from science that support what I believe is the biblical model of creation, which means that God created the earth instantaneously. And I hope that we can all... I'm going to do this for just a second here, so we don't have to go through... There we go. And we're going to put this back together, and it's going to work. Okay. It's coming out. The signal is magically coming to the screen. Good. You see here a cover of the Adventist Review from January of 1999. Why is that important? Well, it's not really important. It's important to me. It's important to me because on the back cover of this review was an ad for two videos, The Young Age of the Earth and Fingerprints of Creation, which I had the privilege of being involved with the creation of these videos. But encapsulated in these videos sort of is the basis of what I'm going to be talking to you about. We're going to be talking about some other things which are not covered in the videos, specifically some comments from the writings of Ellen White. We made these videos in cooperation with the Adventist Media Center to try to introduce to the world a new framework, a framework which can accept scientific data and blend that with with the Bible. We didn't use a lot of Bible text in these videos, but we did use some. And we want to give people the impression and the knowledge that science can be compatible with religion. I know that if you go out into the universities of the world, that they're going to tell you that it can't be compatible. They're going to tell you that you're crazy if you believe in anything that speaks of creationism, especially if you try to say that there's scientific evidence for it. When you talk about the foundations of the earth, when you think about how did the foundations of the earth form, from an evolutionary standpoint, you talk about, as Neil was saying in his prayer, large batholiths of molten magma cooling slowly deep beneath the earth over hundreds of millions of years to the present state which we see them now, which are, I'll use the term igneous rocks, or the most common term, one of the most common igneous rocks we have around here, of course, in nearby Yosemite, is granite rocks. So slow cooling is one of the obvious views of granite formation that we're going to talk about. The other one is, I called fast cooling, but it could actually just mean instantaneous creation. We're not certain exactly how God did it, but we do believe that he did it rapidly, because that's what the Bible says. But the evolutionary standpoint, the evolutionary viewpoint, talks about molten rock deep below the Earth's surface, cooling slowly over many hundreds of thousands and even billions of years, millions of years, to the current state which we have it in now, and then later uplifted to the current position which we see now, of course. The most obvious examples are the giant monolithic structures in Yosemite, El Capitan, Half Dome. But here are some hand-sized pieces of granite. You can see here there are some dark-colored minerals, there's some light-colored minerals. It turns out the dark-colored minerals, if you take those and you cleave them into very thin sections, you can actually study them under the microscope, and you can see some interesting phenomena which are called halos. Now, these halos are caused by little tiny specks of radioactivity which are concentrated in the very small center, and at the center of these specks of radiation is emitted alpha particles, or radiation, and from that radiation, which is shot out at very specific energies, you get a radiation-colored damaged region. And what we're doing is we're looking at it through a cross-section, so it looks like a circle, but it's actually a sphere. In the rock itself, it's a sphere, and you can see here the spherical nature of this in this schematic. The sunburst effect of the alpha damage trails. It produces a spherically colored shell around the halo center. Each arrow represents 5 million alpha particles emitted from the center. Halo coloration develops after 100 million alpha decays, becomes darker after 500 million, and very dark after 1 billion. Now, there's more than just one type of polonium halos. This is actually from the element polonium-214. The first one we saw was from the isotope polonium-210. All of these are from the decay series of uranium-238, which, of course, is the point which we're going to really get to here in a minute, because when evolutionary scientists look at this evidence of creation, the first thing they think of, this is obviously sourced from the naturally occurring uranium-238 decay series, which is got a very long half-life, 4.5 billion years. But the interesting thing that I want to bring out to you is that these polonium halos, here's one of the isotope polonium-218, actually occurs with knowledge that the polonium, in this case the polonium-218, has a half-life of only 3 minutes. Now, you can only see 3 rings here. The middle ring there is the polonium ring from 218, the outer ring is from the polonium-214, and the inner ring is from polonium-210. Now, what is the significance of this in terms of creation, in terms of the evidence for creation? Well, it's simply this. Somehow, now there's going to be a lot of questions as to how, and I don't really have all the answers as to how, but somehow, at the time of creation, now this is a model, right? Which I'm giving you now is my opinion or a model of what I think might have happened. At the time of creation, God, when he was creating the earth, he created the rocks, and at the same time he created the rocks, he put inside the rocks little tiny pieces of radioactive elements, in this case polonium-218, which started to decay. And I'm not going to try to get into, was there radioactive decay before the entrance of sin? I would probably say yes, because that's what my model is depending on right now. If I get to heaven and I find out that I was wrong, then I'll be happy to hear exactly how it happened. But just for the sake of us understanding how this works, and that you have to understand this, what we're actually proposing here is something that is a model, but what this does is it actually prevents evolutionary model from being viewed as something which is tenable. So there's two things going on here. I'm trying to present a model, but at the same time I'm trying to say that the evidence from this model actually is not compatible with an evolutionary viewpoint. So you can make up any model you want to, but the model which I'm trying to, of course, talk about is the model of creation. That somehow when God created the rocks, He also created within those rocks a very short-lived isotope of element, which He placed in the rocks. Then as the rocks solidified, however He did it, called them into existence, solidified them, cooled them, He did it rapidly. And at that point, the clock started ticking. The radiation from these radioactive centers started to irradiate out, make the colored damaged spheres. Within 12 minutes or so, this activity that caused this polonium halo is gone. Why? Because it's a 3-minute half-life. So whatever happened between the time of the magma creation, let's say that magma was created, and then that little speck of radiation was in there, whatever your model is, that model has to say that rock had to cool and crystallize before the clock ran out for these halos to be made. So this halo, basically, it puts a cap on how long the rock cooled from the time it was created to the time it was crystallized, till the time the rock solidifies. So, as you can imagine, this was not something that was discovered overnight. My dad, over many months and probably several months, was developing this thought. And finally, when he saw these halos, he says, I wonder if this is evidence that God left in the rocks, that the rocks actually are created. It was a new thought for him, right? And then he thought, but if that's true, we have to discount what the evolutionists are going to say are their reasons for the polonium halo formation. So they're going to have scientific reasons. They're going to say, oh, well, this polonium was derived from the uranium-238 decay series, which has a 4.5 billion year half-life, which means that the parent of the polonium-218 was feeding the centers of these polonium halos, and thereby that's what was caused. That's what enabled them to develop. And in that case, my dad decided that what he needed to do, and you can see a three-dimensional schematic here of the polonium-218 halo, the different alpha energies, which are very precise, and that's what causes the precise ring structure which we see. And here's a cluster of the polonium-218 halos. We don't just see one, but we see many of them. And I mentioned earlier the granite monolith El Capitan. This is an example of what I would say was a created rock. It's made of granite. Somebody asked me, does this have polonium halos in it? And I'm like, I don't know for certain, because it's not legal to take samples out of a national park and analyze them, but it might have polonium halos in it. But I do know that there are other granites from other parts of the world, many other parts of the world that do. This was just one that has makes a good picture. Psalm 33, 6 and 9, by the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. Again, our model is that the rocks were created rapidly. So, what did the scientific papers show? And I have to apologize here for a minute, that part of this discussion has got to become a little bit technical, because I want to try to illustrate to you that what we're saying here in regards to the polonium halos actually does have a scientific basis, and it does represent information that was published in the open scientific literature. Why is that important? Because if you're trying to reach a secular audience with evidence for creation, you need to publish in their journals. You need to take what you can find from your research, put it in their journals, and then say, hey, take a look at this. This is what I want you to look at. Now, as you might imagine, in these journals, like this one came from the journal Science in 1974. My dad wrote, "It is apparent that polonium halos do pose contradictions to currently held views of Earth history." Now, why didn't he just say, it is apparent that polonium halos represent evidence for creation of the earth by God? Well, that phrase would never have made it past the scientific referee that was refereeing this journal. So this phrase here was actually the strongest wording that he could use and still get it past the referee process. And even this phrase actually was a miracle that they allowed this through. I'm going to give you a couple of different examples from different publications that my dad wrote to these articles. Here's one in the British science journal Nature, where he says, "Do polonium halos imply that unknown processes were operative during the formative period of the Earth? Is it possible that polonium halos in Precambrian rocks represent extinct natural radioactivity and are therefore of cosmological significance?" So he's trying to pose questions, and he's saying, well, telling the reader, hey, think about this, This actually may contradict what you believe about the origin of the rocks and the origin of the Earth. Here's another one, also from Nature, where he says, "A straightforward attempt to account for the origin of these polonium halos by assuming polonium was incorporated into the halo inclusion at the host mineral crystallization." And that's just fancy talk for saying that somehow this radioactivity was placed in the rock at the time of creation. Now, if you're an evolutionist, the rock has a time of creation just like if you're a creationist. For an evolutionist, the rock has a creation when the proto-Earth was spun off of the sun, many billions of years, 4.5 billion years ago or whenever that was, and made the planets. And as the planets were, spinning off the sun and they were continuing to rotate, then slowly cooling over billions of years, this is, of course, how they would think that the original creation of the radioactive elements themselves. That's why they need to say that somehow uranium-238 is the cause of these polonium halos, because they know uranium-238 has a half-life long enough to justify the existence of these halos. If you propose that these halos have an origin separate from uranium-238 decay chain, then you open up a very big problem for the evolutionists, because now you have to explain how did this radioactivity get incorporated into this very, very old rock, manage to leave a pattern that we can see today and not fade away before the rock had solidified over hundreds of millions of years. I mean, within the first 12 minutes, the rock needs to be solidified. We don't have time for it to cool over even 100 years, much less hundreds of thousands or millions of years or billions. So we need it to crystallize almost instantaneously. Now, one of the illustrations that we use to try to help put this picture in people's minds a little bit better is if you have a glass of water and you drop an Alka-Seltzer tablet in it, that Alka-Seltzer tablet begins to what? It starts to fizz, right? Now, does it fizz forever? It has a precise time that it fizzes, right? You drop the tablet in, it's activated, and it starts fizzing. After 30 seconds or so, you look at the water and what do you see? It's clear. There's nothing there, right? So what happens if you want to capture the action of that fizzing while it's happening? You need to do it before the fizzing stops, right? Whatever mechanism you want to do to capture it, take a picture of it, freeze it, whatever it is, whatever you want to do to record that event's going to happen and it's going to be over. That's the point of what we're trying to say, the polonium. The polonium was incorporated into the rock. It's doing its thing. But whatever model of the Earth you have, that model has to explain some kind of mechanism for that rock to crystallize around that halo inclusion before the action stops. The action is going. As soon as the rock is created, as soon as the proto-Earth is, spun off the sun, or whenever the heavier elements are theorized to begun to develop in the evolutionary model, that's when the clock starts. But of course, it's too long. It's much too long, millions of years too long. Anyway, for the creation, for the people that believe in creation, we can model that this is something that, is compatible with creation. It's compatible with God calling the rocks into existence. Did I finish this? A straightforward attempt to account for the origin of these polonium halos by assuming polonium was incorporated into the halo inclusion at the host mineral crystallization meets with severe geological problems. The half-lives of the polonium isotopes, 3 minutes for polonium-218, are too short to permit anything but a rapid mineral crystallization, contrary to acceptable theories of magmatic cooling rates. So there you have it. What we're seeing here is contrary to acceptable theories of magmatic cooling rates. So again, you have to understand these statements in these scientific journals were written as strongly as my dad could write them and still pass the referee process. So that's why you don't see in there, why didn't he just say, this is evidence that God created the rocks by God? Well, we were trying to meet the evolutionists on their own ground, so to speak. That's what we were trying to do. We're trying to get the information in the journals. And what was the response from the scientific community? Well, the response is there. One of the scientists from the University of Chicago, Edward Anders, he said, Gentry's conclusions are startling and shake the very foundations of radiochemistry and geochemistry. I think most people believe, as I do, that some unspectacular explanation will eventually be found for the anomalous halos. Meanwhile, Gentry should be encouraged to keep rattling this skeleton in our closet for all it is worth. So they're encouraging us, right? They're encouraging us. They're saying, keep rattling this skeleton. And so that's what I'm doing here today. I'm rattling the skeleton. It's true, I'm rattling it in front of friends, I mean, here we are as fellow Adventists. We're all on the same team here. But what if this evidence needs to be brought before the attention of the world, where the audience is not friendly? It's a much different story. So there are enemies to this research, people that don't agree with it. And that's always the fun part, right? When you get into controversy. Gentry is not by any stretch of the imagination a scientist. He wishes us to accept that supernatural processes form the basement rocks with no supporting calculations. Now, I just want to stop here for a second. Could we ever give supporting calculations for our model? We can never, he wants us to give supporting, we can't give supporting calculations for something that's a miracle. I appreciated the talk last night by Dan Houghton, where, the pictures and everything he had of Creation Week, it was phenomenal. I really appreciated it. I'm glad they're going into the new hospital. I'll be able to see those every day when I go to work, and I look forward to that. But we can't give calculations, so I'm sorry to say that we're not going to be able to give the calculations that he wants here. But even the same critical scientist that talked about he not believing this results, he says, finally, in another publication, still, we must give Gentry his due. Nothing in geology fully explains the apparent occurrence of the polonium halos as described by Gentry. They do remain a minor mystery in the field of physics. So even the most critical observers, the people that don't believe at all in what we're saying here, even they have to admit, hey, there's something going on here that we don't understand. They do remain a minor mystery. And so this was, part of what my dad was giving him the idea to call his book Creation's Tiny Mystery. Because these little halos are little tiny specks of, they're microscopic, but they're a mystery even to the world scientist, why they exist. And trust me, we're doing everything we can to try to give another explanation for these halos that would be compatible with the evolutionary viewpoint. I mean, we're actually, I'm saying that kind of as a joke, but essentially that's what's happening. In fact, this slide here is probably the one that's going to be the most difficult to try to convey about what I'm trying to say here. But each of these dots, each one of these bulletin points actually represents a separate scientific paper. So you can imagine, I tried to summarize a scientific paper with one bullet point. That's not going to turn out very well, is it? The first one is polonium centers lack excess fossil alpha recoil tracks. Movement of any hypothetical alpha emitting solutions would have left tracks. So this addresses the evolutionist claim that says what you have then are uranium-bearing solutions migrating through the mica, and the radio centers of the polonium halos are selectively pulling out the polonium daughter products. And at that time, that's when you have the concentration of polonium necessary to make the polonium halo. But the point is, they're saying is that it's all derived from uranium-238. Remember, it's got to come from uranium-238. Why? Because uranium-238 has a long enough half-life to survive the evolution of the Earth, 4.5 billion years. But the problem is when Dad did the scientific experiments to see if there were any excess fossil alpha recoil tracks, he would etch the mica surface with acid, and then he would look at the pits, the little pits that would be occurring from the background uranium that was present throughout the mineral, and he could see that there was no increased density as you come near to the polonium halos. There was no increased density of the background uranium alpha, the alpha recoil fission tracks because, well, he would like to believe, or he was trying to postulate that these halos did not come from uranium-bearing solutions. He says if they did come from uranium-bearing solutions, the density of these tracks would increase the closer they get to the halo, because you would have the uranium feeding the sites of these polonium halo centers. But he says since they're not increasing, that was evidence that these polonium halos were not coming from the uranium-bearing solutions. So that was one paper. And I was actually trying to explain what I was going to be talking about this weekend to a friend of mine to see if it made sense before I came here. And they were just looking at me saying, I don't understand. I was like, oh no, this is going to be terrible. But anyway, just suffer with me just for a minute, okay? I know it's terrible. But I'm not smart enough to say it any better than this, okay? I'm doing my best. The second paper talks about the ion microprobe evidence. And that is that when you actually look at the radio halo centers now, what you see is the final daughter product of the uranium-238 decay series. And also the daughter product of polonium. It's the same thing, lead-206 and lead-207. Okay, here we go. What is a lead-206 to lead-207 ratio? Why does that even matter? Well, it matters a little bit because of this. Let me say it this way. Naturally occurring uranium, if you go out into the nature and you mine uranium, okay? You're a uranium miner, you mine uranium, it's going to have a certain abundance of the different isotopes that belong to uranium. And the abundance of those isotopes is actually very well known. Uranium-238, the ratio of uranium-238 to uranium-235 is one of the most studied elemental abundances ever known to modern science. Why? Because in the preparation for the Manhattan Project, they needed to know how much uranium-235 was available and in what proportion it was available in order to enrich that uranium ore to increase the abundance of uranium-235 so that they could make fission material for the bombs. So the theory behind the uranium-238 to 235 ratios is very well known. It's very well established. Now, the lead 206 to the lead 206 to 207 ratios, why does that matter? Lead 206 is the end daughter product of uranium 238. Lead 207 is the end daughter product of uranium 235. If you study the end product, okay, of the polonium halo centers, you see the end result of the decay chains of both uranium 238 and uranium 235. But that ratio that we found in the halo centers did not match at all the elemental abundances of uranium 238 to 235. In other words, the ratio is like, for instance, for an example, let's say the ratio of the uranium 235 to 238 to 235 is 137. So there's 137 more times uranium 238 in the world than uranium 235. That means that when we study the halo centers and we see what is left there, we should see the same isotopic abundance of the daughter products that the uranium itself that was, okay, using the evolutionary model. If you're proposing that the uranium form these halos, you know, then the abundance or the isotopic abundance of the daughter products should match what you naturally see in nature, but it doesn't match. In fact, the isotope is like 206 to 207 ratios is like sometimes over 2,000. So in other words, it was almost pure polonium 218 that caused these halos with no contamination of uranium 235. So my point is this. These papers were trying to address, okay, this is the bottom line. They were trying to address possible arguments that the evolutionist would bring to say that this came by natural means. And when we saw, or when my dad saw through this ion microprobe analysis, that these isotopic abundances had no relationship to the naturally occurring isotopic abundance that you would expect in these halos, then that was another evidence that what we're dealing with here is polonium that was what my dad would say is primordial polonium that was not derived from uranium-238 decay. So, there you have it. Here's the third one. I apologize about this. I realize myself that I don't even understand this very well myself, but anyway, I'm doing my best. Polonium halos don't have a ring from the decay of radon-22. Why does that matter? Well, in the uranium decay series, uranium-238 decays to thorium-236, beta decays to protactinium-236, beta decays to uranium-230, alpha decays to uranium-234, alpha decays to radium-226, alpha decays to radon-222. So the point, what I'm trying to say is, in the naturally decaying uranium decay series is a ring from your radon-222. If you were to propose that these halos were derived from uranium-238, they should have a ring from radon-222. Well, they don't have it. And in fact, if you look at the uranium-238 halos, that's another discussion, but I'll just tell you that briefly that in fluorite, the radon-222 ring from the uranium-238 halos is actually resolvable in those pictures. The picture of it is in my dad's book. But the halos, the polonium halos don't show the radon ring. They should show it if, in fact, those halos are derived from uranium-238. So I'm going into all this detail to try to explain to you that a tremendous amount of effort was exerted to try to explain the halos in terms of an evolutionary explanation. That's my point.
And it didn't work.
And it didn't work.
It didn't work.
It didn't work because each paper kept showing that this polonium was something other than the polonium from uranium-238 decay. And eventually, By the way, Don, do me a huge favor and tell me what time do I stop? Because I'm actually going to be finishing. This lecture is too long for one service, and so I told Don that I would give two different talks, but really it's actually just a continuation of the same talk. They're not really two different topics. They're just more details and more things that I'll be talking about. But I have there's a lot of stuff here that I'm going to be saying, but I want to stop at the right time. How much time?
Maybe 5 minutes.
Okay. We're going to go for 5 more minutes, and then we're going to continue the rest of what I'm going to be talking about in the next hour. And I'm going to really shock you the next hour. I'm going to shock you really bad. This hour was just to put you to sleep. But next hour is I'm going to wake you up. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. I won't wake you up. I'll let you sleep. I would never point you out if I saw Don falling asleep here in the front row. I would never embarrass him and say, "Wake up, Don." That's terrible. I don't like it when preachers do that, because sometimes I've been the one to fall asleep. But this evidence for creation was, as it began circulating, it became more and more known, so that, and I don't know the backstory to this, but there were movements in the United States to treat the teaching of evolution on an equal basis with scientific creationism. Well, of course, the state that passed that law was Arkansas. They said, what we want to do for our public schools is we want to require that evolution can be taught, but also they need to teach about scientific creationism as well. Well, immediately there was a lawsuit. That's not going to work. The American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit saying that you're not going to do that, because number one, there's no such thing as scientific creationism. So we're gonna stomp on that right away. Well, the state, obviously, the plaintiff, or the defendant, I guess you could say, the defendant, immediately started phoning around to the various scientists and creation organizations and saying, "Hey, we need to get some creation scientists together to defend our law here. We just got through saying that there's evidence for creation, and we're going to teach it in our schools, and so you all need to come and tell us what we're going to teach." And the scientists, I guess, the creationists, were called one by one, and they ended up calling my dad, and they're saying, because of what you've published, and maybe it was known, I'm not sure how it was known, that he had creationist viewpoints, because at that particular time he did not widely circulate what his beliefs were, I guess, at least in the scientific literature. But in any event, he was one of the ones that was called. And on the witness stand, after listening to the evidence for creation, there was an evolutionist on the witness stand who was asked by the judge, I'm trying to get this right, after the judge had listened to the testimony of the evidence for creation, he actually asked the evolutionary witness, he was like, "Now, what was this about the Gentry's work that was so relevant or important here?" And so now we're reading what the evolutionary scientist is telling the judge about his explanation of the polonium halos, right? It's his explanation to the judge. So now we have the evolutionist explaining the evidence for creation here to the judge. He's saying, in Gentry's work, he proposed a very tiny mystery. Again, this is before my dad's book, Creation's Tiny Mystery, but this is like where he got the title, which is balanced on the other side by an enormous amount of evidence. And by the way, all it takes to collapse all the evidence of evolution is just one little tiny thing that doesn't quite fit, and it's like a house of cards. That's what we're saying here, because if the polonium halo evidence is really true, what it does is it attacks the uniformitarian principle, which undergirds the entire theory of evolution. And if you attack the foundation of evolution, it's like a house of cards that comes down. Yes, there's a lot of evidence to them that supports evolution if you accept their premises. But if you knock out the premises, boom, all of a sudden all this enormous evidence kind of goes away. But anyway, and I think, and he continues and he says, and I think it's important to know what the answer to that little mystery is. He's saying, I'm not discounting it. I think it's important to know what the answer is. He says, if you have a granitic body, okay, maybe he's going to explain it better than I did. If you have a granitic body, a rock that comes from the melt that contains this mica. Mica is one of the crystallines, one of the crystals that's contained in granite, okay, mica or biotite. It contains this mica. It cools down. It takes millions of years for a body like that to cool. So what he's doing, he's explaining to the judge our evolutionary viewpoint that it's taking millions of years for this rock to cool. He said so that by the time the body cooled, all the polonium would have decayed, right? So if you have the polonium in the rock, by the time the rock cools, all the polonium is gone, and there's nothing left to make the polonium halos. Okay. Since it has an extremely short half-life, 3 minutes. Therefore, there would be no polonium in the body to cause the polonium halos. So what he is saying, or Gentry is saying, this is primordial polonium. Remember, I just got through taking 10 minutes trying to explain to you that the polonium that we see here is primordial polonium, not polonium based upon, not polonium derived from uranium-238. So that's why he's saying primordial polonium. This is primordial polonium. Therefore, the granite mass in which it occurs could not have cooled suddenly. Therefore, it must have been created by fiat instantly. Testimony of Brent Dalrymple at the 1981 Arkansas creation trial. So this opens the door now for the world to kind of take to examine, start examining this evidence, because now a lot of scientists that had never heard of this before, they're being confronted with it. And they go back and they look at the papers in Science and in Nature and they're like, wait a minute, is this stuff really in here? And they look and they're like, yeah, I guess it is. And they look and they don't like it, they don't agree with it, but it's there. It's there. It's there, it's there, it's there. So, there's more. There's more, but I want to continue it here in a few minutes while we take a break. And I'm warning you that if you don't like the spirit of prophecy on the next presentation, you better stay outside. Because I love talking to Adventist audiences because we can talk about the spirit of prophecy and I don't have to apologize about it. And when we give presentations to the secular scientists or to the world, we talk about the scientific evidence and we talk about some Bible texts a little bit, but we don't talk about the spirit of prophecy. But to me, you get the power. Anyway, you'll see.
Okay. How many of you followed that? Look at all those hands. He was so nervous he didn't even want to turn around. He's like, yeah, we understood that. We understood what you were saying, so that was a great blessing. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We're going to come back. If I were you, I would probably not leave your seat because other people will take it. But 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start our 11 o'clock service with a special presentation to one of the individuals that helped us, or several that helped us with the Sabbath trail that we are going to unveil this afternoon. Let's take a 10-minute break.